So yeah, this picture of Urquhart Castle. Now I'm choosing to do this with water-soluble ink because I just fancy doing something simpler without the faff. And I'm going to start about a third of the way up the paper and then just sort of sketch it out really. But I might put a couple of lines in. Obviously I'm going to go directly in with pen. I'll just charge this little fountain pen up. I'm just looking at the sort of ratios. That's where the bridge starts. Actually, maybe starts a little bit further back. Yeah. And then there's a sort of ramped area that goes up to where that island starts there. So that's that little upright. And then we've got that gable end is there, and then there is that part sort of there, and then the end is, I'd say, about there. So kind of what I've done there is I've just along the line I've looked at those proportions of how big the island is and how big the castle is, and then where the bridge starts. Now that's really like that's really basic, and it doesn't actually matter if those ratios are wrong. It doesn't matter if any of the ratios in your drawing are wrong. But for me, it's just nice to sort of slightly lay that out. Now, I've got my island there, and I know behind there's going to be some other land sort of coming down there. Right, so I'm going to start sketching. So where do I start? Well, I'll start over here, and I'll work this way, just simply for the fact that then I'm not dragging the ink. I'm not using this part of my hand on the wet ink, if you know what I mean. So, because if I started here, as I move my hand across, I could smear it. I've had a really busy week at work, and I just got back and I saw my mum's, my late mother's fountain pen, which I haven't used in a while. And I thought I'd dig it out and have a little sketch with it. And I don't know why, but sometimes these little things just, it's a little touchstone, isn't it? I don't know. So I'm going to start on this little island here, and I'm going to just look at how those shapes of the rocks are. I'm using a continuous line method here. As you can see, I'm keeping the nib on the paper as much as I can, really. There's an awful lot of sort of seaweed down here, so I can put in a few little extra sort of details like that. And now obviously this is going to be a water soluble ink painting effectively, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the drawing, and then I'm going to go back in with a brush and some water, and I'm going to paint the actual scene. Now, because water soluble ink, it can be reacted in the same way that watercolour can be reacted once it's dry. I must be careful I don't go too far along here, because I need to start putting this part of the castle in here. What was I saying? Yeah. So you can sketch it out, and then you can let it dry if you want, and then go back in with a brush and some water, and then basically sort of like colour in. Now, because it's a monotone, you're not colouring in a sense. What you're doing is you're just adding tonal value. So in a way, this is a sort of value study. Now, if you're not familiar with the term a volume study or notum studies, is what they are is it's a monotone sketch where you're just looking at lights and darks, and you're representing that in one colour normally. Now, the reason why value studies are so good is because when you're creating art, the one thing you do that you don't normally do in life, unfortunately, is you're really looking. And when you really study a subject, such as when you're drawing it, you start to see tonal changes and value changes, lights, darks, sometimes even sort of like, textures that you wouldn't normally necessarily see if you were just sort of looking at a photograph, a glimpse, if you know what I mean, just a little quick glimpse at a scene. I'm not 100% sure where the windows are there, so I'm just going to put some sort of arbitrary guesses in. I could zoom in, I guess, on the tablet. Oh yeah, that's much better. So yes, subjects that have an awful lot of colour in them don't necessarily work so well for sort of value studies or these kind of artworks, because part of their story, if you know what I mean, is their bright colours, but high contrast subjects that often have quite flat colour do, because they have quite a contrasting sort of lights and darks. Now, I'm not saying that you can't use this technique on anything, because you can use this technique on absolutely anything. But personally, I think it works well for quite simple scenes that have a higher level of sort of obvious contrast. So this castle was obviously rebuilt at some point in the Scottish sort of baronial style, because it's got all these little turrets and like crazy little additional bits, which to me are a little bit too decorative for what is essentially an outpost keep, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I don't know the history of Ireland, Don. I'm sure it's available in 5 minutes on the internet, so I should probably check it out. Right. Now I've got to be careful here. I don't get too bogged down in details, because that's going to sometimes spoil slightly the enjoyment of these looser sketches, if you know what I mean. I'm going to try and keep it rolling a bit and keep it nice and free. Right, so I've got that top line in, so then I can go and fill in some of these details down here. Now this wall at this point is pretty blank, so I can start looking at other lines, and there is a stone wall here that's quite an important feature, because it kind of runs all the way down there. Now, because it's a stone wall and it's got a wobbly top, because it looks like quite an uneven stone wall, I'm obviously going to suggest that silhouette texture with a bit of a wobbly line there. That will continue a little bit, I guess, and then I have some tree details, and I could put some suggestions at the bottom of the wall there. Maybe even do a few little bricks on the wall. You don't have to, but it's often nice, again, just to use that as a bit of a visual shortcut. Slope and some of the foliage is creating some sort of lines that run down, and it also is using those sort of contour lines is a good way of suggesting that this is a slope and not just a solid flat cliff. So this week I've been working at the Great Yorkshire Show, doing some photography there, which the Great Yorkshire Show is probably the biggest event really in Yorkshire annually, and it's a huge agricultural show. It's amazing. Hundreds of, well over 100,000 people visit every year, and I get to see some lovely old friends, make some new ones. So yes, it was very good, but they are long days. And it's the first time in a long time where I haven't done any drawing. Literally no drawing for like a week. And it was funny, when I woke up this morning, it was the first thing I thought of. And my wife very kindly, my partner, took the kids to the park so I could have a little bit of a lie-in. But I decided to get out of bed instead of lying in and actually do some drawing while the house was quiet. And but the nice thing is every time you sit down and you do a little bit of a 5-minute sketch, what you're actually doing is you're training your brain and your hands to work in exactly the same way that people who play musical instruments will understand, or people who do very complicated things with their hands in their job, whether it is, surgery or plastering or, playing the drums or whatever. So what you're doing is you're strengthening the connection between your brain and your fingers and your eyes so that you can look at a reference drawing or you can look at an image when you're out in the countryside and you can translate that through your eyes into your brain, into your hands and onto the paper. Now that translation, which we call drawing, is quite magical and quite unique to you. So you should celebrate your own language in a sense, because that's what actually is your sort of superpower. When you're doing sort of landscape drawings or even in graphic design, you always try and have your horizon line, your halfway line, or a significant silhouette in the drawing, either halfway or a third of the way up. If it ends up being sort of 60-40%, if it ends up being in the middle but then slightly to one side, it looks like you can't make your mind up. Now, some drawings, it doesn't matter at all. In fact, it doesn't matter at all anyway. But it's just one of those particular points that I was taught, and it's something I often notice actually on my own work. So my horizon line, I guess, is the wall, and not here. But anyway, as I was saying, I'm going to try and put a little bit of reflection detail in here. So that's not an easy thing to do when you're using this technique, because you have to, it's obviously, we're dealing with quite a binary technique here. It's either light or dark. There's no shade. That sort of happens kind of at a later date when we start putting a little bit of water into the mix. So what I might do is I might just do some suggestion and then maybe go back in and do more. Now that suggestion is going to be horizontal lines, because that's normally how reflections appear on the water. And I'm going to just do a little suggestion of a chimney, and maybe another one, and then there. get the right concentrations. So anyway, so here I've got an egg cup with some clean water in, and I'm going to use some of these. This is an Artify, pretty cheap brushes, but they're pretty good. I tend to go through brushes at a fair rate. This one was sent to me to review. I must get around to reviewing it, but I think it's pretty positive, I have to say. One of the nice things about them is they're for floral painting, so they are quite stiff. So they do tend to keep their shape quite well. So if you're doing sort of little detail work, they're really, really quite good. So again, I'm going to start over this side. The first thing I'll do is put a little bit of something on these mountains. I think it won't be anything complicated, maybe just something like that. One of the things you can do is if it's a tiny bit too dark when you do this, so if you were to go along this edge and maybe run those bits up there like that, you want to put some little dots and details back there, and you think, oh, actually that's a little bit dark, take your tissue and press it down on that area there. And you can see, oops, that's something else there. You can see how much it pulls off. I'll just do that one more time on here. So you can see that it's quite dark there, and again, just suck it out. The paper that I'm using here is Cardi paper, which has a lot of texture, but it's also it's pretty absorbent. It's one of my favourite papers. It's homemade. Homemade? No, it's handmade in India. Nice and thick. Got loads of texture. It's got these crazy edges. I just think it's fun, and it's not expensive. So looking at this scene then, we've got a lot of texture in these rocks, which kind of goes up there like that. I am not going to do loads of fiddly details. I might even start adding a little bit more in the water as I'm going. Why not? Bearing in mind that the water is at this sort of reflection. Again, I might just pull a bit of that out. I don't want it to be too dark. Again, the tissue is a much maligned tool in watercolour and ink. I find that if I go out sketching or drawing and I don't have one of my trusted tissues with me, I feel quite alarmed in a way that, you know, if I don't have a pencil or the right size brush, it doesn't bother me, but I use tissue so much. Now we have this stone wall here, which has a bit of texture to it, so I'll do a few dabs on there. Again, I don't want to get too carried away with this. And then we've got some trees. A bit more, there's one here, and then there's these ones here. Now, these do look very dark, so what I'll do is, you see, I'm just sort of spattering it on to get some vague tree type shapes and some trunks. So I'm just going to give that a moment, and then I'm going to, again, just dab some of that out. But what you will see is it does leave those shapes, those slightly abstract shapes, particularly here you'll see that. So you see, you get a sort of feel for tree, if you know what I mean. And again, if I put a darker line in here, but leave, I mean, I wonder if you can lift out even more. It'd be worth a try, re-wetting it. And then lift out even more. Yeah, you can. You see how much ink I'm pulling off here. Now, arguably, you could say, well, why don't you just use a lighter solution of ink? Well, that's very true, you could. But for me, I quite like these faster way of working. I think it has a little bit more immediacy. I think the images actually look, if anything, just a little bit more punchy and interesting. So I quite like the minimal feel to this. I don't want to do too much, but I do want to work on some of this shadow detail. On this side of the castle, I might add a bit more on. there and under the bridge. So let's crack on with this. Now you'll see, as soon as I put water on this, even though it's dried, it will reactivate. It will reactivate the ink. Again, that might be a tiny bit dark, so I'm just being mindful of pulling out a bit. You can actually bring pigment in from other areas as well if you want, like here. And again, I can bring a little bit more pigment in. The more you work an area, the slightly darker it will get. I'll just leave that there. What I'm going to do as well is I'm actually going to do some of these windows, because I think when they're just empty like that, they can look a bit weird, whereas I do quite like it when there's a bit of suggestion of something going on there. I think it looks a little bit more realistic. This is quite a dark area in here, so I can leave that quite dark. Right. There we go. Now there's a bit more detail on this wall as well. Put a few spots on there. I'm going to just put a few dots on this, again on this brickwork. You see the way I'm using the brush, just on its side. That's a tiny bit too dark, I might pull that out. I'm just suggesting that there are some areas, there's some texture there, again. Not too much, so I don't want that to go dark, too dark, because I'm going to put in some shadows there underneath those arches. And they're going to be quite dark, those, because that's one of the big shadow points of this image. There you go. So I'm going to leave that quite dark in there. And I'm going to do the same on this side. But then I'm going to extend that down into the water here. Like that, and then do the same there. Again, if you work it a bit more, you will get a little bit more ink out of that. There we go. I even take a bit of ink from this area here, which you can take ink from one area and kind of move it to another, which is quite useful. I'll lighten that a tiny bit. So I think that's not far off for this. There is a little bit more shadow detail to do on some of these sides here. I think that would be in shadow, in fairness, and here. Maybe there. Put a little bit on there. Really need to get another tissue on the go here. This is getting silly now. There's a little bit of shadow on there. Okay, so probably not far off. Keep saying that, don't I? A little bit on that chimney. A bit more there. A bit more there. Okay. Now I could put some texture on the castle itself, but I don't want to end up putting dots all over every surface, because then it's going to end up looking a little bit busy. I've put some dots on the wall there to suggest texture, so I might not do anything on the castle, I'll leave that. Again, I could put some texture on the hillside up here, but I really want the focus to draw in on the castle, so I'm going to leave it there. I think it's quite nice, it's quite minimal. The one thing I want to do is reinstate a little bit more of the shadow, not the shadow, the reflection of the castle down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some ink from these areas here, and I'm going to paint in a bit more of a reflection. You can see in the reference picture it is a bit more defined. And I'm not going to be too specific, if you know what I mean. The problem is I don't really want to lose some of this lovely reflections that I have. So I've got to be careful and just add a tiny bit more water. Yeah. Just trying to define that whole area a little bit more. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just not quite getting enough. So I'm going to use my pen, which of course has dried up in the 2 seconds it's been not used. Some pens are better than others, and for some reason this old Parker seems to dry up really quickly. Anyway, so I'm going to put in some more lines here. You see, I'm just sort of really should be careful I don't score the paper too much, because it could end up causing me too many problems. Okay, well, I'll just put in some lines like that, and then I'm gonna just add in, before that gets a chance to dry too much, you can be a bit abstract with this, actually. You know, I think you can start to be a bit too, it gets a bit too painterly, if you know what I mean. It gets a bit too fussy. So I'll just put some finishing touches on that, and I think we're done. There we go. So that looks probably a little bit too heavy, I think, in terms of some of these really dark blue areas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some more water on them here, and then I'm going to use the tissue one last time, and I'm going to pull out a little bit of that pigment here. There we go. Okay, well, I think I'll leave it at that. Looks good. I like it. So I hope you enjoyed that little water-soluble ink play. I think the sky worked really well. It's interesting looking back at the bit where I hadn't put any other detail in. I think you could have really have just left it there without actually completing any of the other bits of the drawing. I particularly like this area down here. That works really well. I think the reflection ended up being a bit of a mess. It ended up getting a little bit sort of overworked, and it lost a little bit of its sparkle that it had at the beginning. But again, you know, knowing when to stop is always a challenge when it comes to your own art. I think I've learned so much from doing that. You know, it's probably one of the first times I've gone in and done the sky first. We're using water-soluble ink, and then put the reflection in. And actually, it really is, it's really powerful. You could see when I just had the actual subject, almost like a negative. So I had the subject in white and just the sky and the watercolour. That was that looked wonderful. So I think it's always interesting when you're doing any process to review it as you go along and see at what stage it really speaks to you, if you know what I mean. So it'd be very easy to look at any piece of work you did and start to pick faults in it. But as I was saying before, you know, do you enjoy the process? I love doing this. It was really fun. And isn't that really the main thing? So I hope you guys got something from that, and thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today. The reference picture is obviously going to be on my website, so you can go and take that and have a go at sketching this yourself, or try it in a different media. So I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time.